$10,000. That is what one woman paid for 80 acres of high desert scrubland in Harrow County in the spring of 1995. 80 acres that the county land office had been sitting on for 6 years after the previous owner's estate had failed to find a single buyer at any price above $8,000, and that the county's property commissioner had personally described, in the listing summary he filed that spring, as suitable for recreational use or land banking and unsuitable for any commercial, agricultural, or industrial purpose due to the absence of surface water and the documented depth of the water table. The commissioner who filed that summary was the same man who sat on the Harrow County Regional Water Planning Board 8 years later, in 2003, watching a representative from Consolidated Western Water Authority explain to the board and to every news camera that had shown up for the session that the 80 acres in question sat directly above a confined artesian aquifer with a documented reserve capacity that the authority's hydrological team had assessed at a present value extraction write-off, just over $5 million, and that the woman who had bought those 80 acres for $10,000 8 years earlier had been offered that sum in exchange for a perpetual water rights conveyance and had declined to sell outright, which was the detail that made the news cameras stay for the afternoon session instead of leaving after the announcement. Cora Lund had declined to sell because she had not bought the land to sell it. She had bought it because the county's own geological survey from 1962, filed in the state's public records archive and available to anyone who drove to the Capitol and asked for it, contained a 14-page section on the subsurface hydrology of Harrow County's high desert plateau that described, in the careful language of mid-century survey geology, a structural basin in the Permian limestone formation at depth that the survey team had identified as a probable confined aquifer of significant volume, a finding that had been noted and then apparently not acted on by anyone in the county for 33 years. Either because the drilling technology of the 1960s made the formation's depth economically inaccessible, or because the county's attention had been on its irrigated bottomland rather than its high plateau, or simply because the 14-page section was on page 87 of a 112-page document that most people had never opened. Stuart Hinch had not opened it. He had been the county's property commissioner for 9 years when he filed the listing summary that called the 80 acres unsuitable for any commercial purpose, and he had been on the Regional Water Planning Board for 6 of those years, and in none of those years had he pulled the 1962 geological survey from the state archive, because the survey was 33 years old by the time he filed the listing, and nothing in his routine administration of county land assets had given him a reason to look at old geological documents on land that had no obvious commercial use. Cora Lund had pulled it because she made a habit, before buying any piece of land, of reading every public record she could find that described what was under it, and the 1962 survey had been on her kitchen table for 2 weeks before she drove to the county land office and offered $10,000 for 80 acres that nobody else had wanted for 6 years. None of that had happened, yet on the May morning in 1995, when she signed the papers, drove to the land, and stood in the scrub desert looking at 80 acres of rock and dry brush that would have seemed entirely featureless to anyone who had not read what was documented to lie several hundred feet below the surface, and started planning how to prove it. Harrow County sat in the high desert plateau country of its state, a stretch of territory where most of the county's productive activity happened in the irrigated valley floor 20 miles to the west, and the plateau itself was treated as the county's geographic backdrop rather than any part of its economic consideration, too dry for farming without expensive water infrastructure, too remote for most residential development, and too featureless in its scrubland surface to attract recreational attention beyond the occasional hunting lease. Stuart Hinch had been administering the county's land assets for 9 years with the competence and genuine diligence of someone who took the work seriously and who had developed, over those 9 years, a reliable working knowledge of what the county's various land types were worth and how they performed under different uses, a knowledge base that was accurate for the land types he encountered regularly and that had a gap in it the size of a 33-year-old geological survey that described a subsurface formation he had never had reason to look for. He sat on the Regional Water Planning Board because his county land administration experience made him a useful member, and the board's work had focused, for most of his tenure, on the valley floor's irrigation infrastructure and the surface water rights that governed it, a domain where his knowledge was genuinely relevant. The plateau's subsurface hydrology had not come up at any board meeting he had attended, because the plateau had never been part of anyone's water planning conversation, because the only water planning conversations Harrow County had ever needed were about the valley floor's surface water, because the plateau was universally understood to be dry, which it was at the surface, in every season, without variation, which was the only characteristic of it that anyone in the county's administrative structure had ever needed to know. Cora Lund had grown up in a different kind of country, dryland ranch territory 2 states over, where the relationship between surface appearance and subsurface hydrology was something farmers and ranchers understood in the specific way that people understand things they have personally lost money not knowing. And she had come to Harrow County 3 years before the purchase with a background in land assessment that had been built in dry country, and that started from a different assumption then. The one Harrow County's property administrator operated from, which was that the absence of surface water and the depth of the water table were 2 different facts that did not necessarily point to the same conclusion. She had been looking at Harrow County's plateau properties for 2 of those 3 years before she found the 1962 survey in the state archive, and what she had found in the survey had converted a general interest in the plateau's undervalued land into a specific interest in the 80 acres whose subsurface geology the survey described in most detail, an interest she had pursued quietly through the standard channels of a county land office transaction that Stuart Hench had processed without any particular attention, because it was the kind of small, unremarkable land sale that took up 20 minutes of a property commissioner's week and that he had no reason to think about again once the paperwork was filed. Dora Spears had been ranching the 40-acre parcel adjacent to the Lund property since her husband's death 5 years earlier, a modest cattle operation that she ran with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who has been doing a hard job alone long enough to have stopped thinking of it as hard. And she was the first person to come over to the new neighbor's property the week after the sale, partly out of the standard neighborly instinct of plateau country and partly out of genuine curiosity about what anyone had found in that parcel worth buying. She asked the question directly, because direct was the mode that plateau country favored, and Cora told her, with the same directness, that she thought there might be significant water underneath it, which produced the reaction that this information tended to produce in Harrow County, which was a moment of very quiet consideration followed by a polite suggestion that the county's water table on the plateau was well documented and ran at depths that made extraction prohibitively expensive. Cora said she understood the conventional water table position and that what she was looking at was something different, something a lot deeper and a different formation entirely, and showed Dora the relevant section of the 1962 survey, which Dora read with the careful attention of a rancher who knows what it would mean to have reliable water access in plateau country and who is therefore not inclined to dismiss the topic quickly. Dora said she had never seen that document before. Cora said she had found it in the state archive in the capital. Dora asked how she had known to look there. Cora said she made a habit of reading everything filed about a piece of land before she bought it, which was advice that Dora received and thought about for a long time after she drove home, without doing anything specific with it, because the adjacent 80 acres had been a county listing for 6 years, and the time to have acted on that kind of reading was now someone else's history. She told Cora that if it turned out to be true, she was glad it was her neighbor who had found it rather than someone who would wall the whole plateau off, and Cora told her she appreciated that and meant it, and they became, over the following years, the kind of neighbors that plateau country tends to produce. Useful to each other in practical ways and respectful of each other's business in the specific sense that neither one asked more questions than the other was ready to answer. Dr. Petra Solano had spent 15 years as a hydrological consultant for water rights cases and municipal water supply assessments, and she arrived at Cora's property on a Thursday morning in the second year at Cora's specific request, following a letter that had enclosed photographs of the 1962 survey's relevant sections alongside Cora's own measurements of the surface formation and a series of soil probe readings she had taken at 40-meter intervals across the 80 acres. Solano had read the survey section before she drove out, which was something she had specifically requested, and she spent the morning on the property running a portable resistivity survey that she had brought in 2 cases in the back of her truck, equipment that measured subsurface electrical resistance as a proxy for geological formation and water content at depth. She ran 17 transects across the property before she set the equipment up at the truck and looked at the data on her laptop screen for 20 minutes without saying anything to Cora. "The formation is there," she said finally. "The survey team in 1962 was looking at the right structure. What they couldn't tell from a surface survey is the lateral extent, and what I'm seeing in the resistivity data suggests the lateral extent is considerably larger than what the survey described, which was already significant." She explained what a confined artesian aquifer meant in practical terms: water trapped under pressure between impermeable rock layers, which produced natural upwelling when accessed rather than requiring pumping energy, which made extraction economics dramatically different from a conventional drilled well, and which was the reason that documented confined systems commanded premium water rights valuations when a municipality or water authority needed a reliable, pressure-fed source at scale. She told Cora what the survey would need to confirm the reserve capacity estimate to the level of confidence that a water authority would require for a rights transaction, which was a vertical test bore at specific locations she would identify, a task that required equipment and permitting beyond what either of them could manage without a formal engagement with a licensed hydrogeology firm. She asked Cora what her plan was for the information. Cora said she wanted it documented correctly before she did anything else with it. And Solano said that was the right order and asked how she planned to fund the test bore program, which Cora said she had been thinking about for the previous year and had a partial answer to, which she would explain if Solano was interested in the engagement. Solano said she was interested. Cora did not tell Stuart Hinch or the Regional Water Planning Board what Petra Solano's resistivity survey had found, and she made no public statements about the property's potential through the third and fourth years while the test bore program moved through its permitting phase and eventual drilling, a process that was slower and more expensive than she had budgeted for, and that consumed most of the savings she had not put into the land purchase itself. She had secured the test bore engagement with Solano's firm through a cost-sharing arrangement that gave the firm a small percentage of any future water rights transaction in exchange for absorbing a portion of the drilling costs, a structure that Solano's firm agreed to because the resistivity data was compelling enough that the risk seemed worth taking. Doris Spears knew the bore drilling was happening because the equipment was visible from her ranch and she had asked, and Cora had told her, in the same direct mode their initial conversation had established, that the test bore results would determine whether the 1962 survey's finding was as significant as the resistivity data suggested, and that she would tell Dora what the results showed when she knew. Dora said she appreciated that, and spent the weeks of the drilling watching from her property with the focused attention of someone who has a personal stake in an adjacent outcome and is trying not to think too carefully about what it might be. Stuart Hinch drove past the property during the drilling and noticed the equipment without stopping, because drilling activity on private land in the plateau wasn't unusual enough to warrant investigation from a property commissioner's perspective, and he had no particular connection to the Lund parcel beyond having filed the sale paperwork 6 years earlier. He would think about that paperwork for a long time in the months after the water board session. The test bore results came back in the 5th year with reserve capacity estimates that Solano's firm qualified as conservative in their methodology, and that Cora read at her kitchen table on the same surface where the 1962 survey had sat for 2 weeks a decade earlier, and she spent an evening doing the arithmetic on the water rights valuation range that the results supported before she called Solano and asked, plainly, what the right next step was. Solano told her the right next step was a formal presentation to a water authority or municipal buyer with the documented reserve data and a water rights conveyance structure that protected Cora's interests while making the resource accessible to public supply. She also told Cora that before any public disclosure, she should speak with a water rights attorney, because the transaction she was describing was large enough that the structure of the rights conveyance would determine most of the value, and that getting that structure wrong would be a different kind of expensive than any of the costs she had absorbed so far. Cora called a water rights attorney the following week, spent 3 months working through the conveyance structure, and filed the documentation with the State Water Resources Agency in the spring, a filing that triggered the standard notification process to regional water planning boards, which was how Stuart Hinch learned that a filing had been made by the owner of the 80 acres he had sold for $10,000 that described a confined artesian aquifer reserve with a documented capacity that the filing's hydrological certification put in a valuation range. He read 3 times before he put the notification down and looked out his office window for a while. He called the board's hydrological consultant that afternoon to ask whether the filing's methodology was standard. He was told it was. He called Cora the following day, the first time he had spoken to her since the land sale, and asked whether she would be willing to meet before the scheduled board session. She told him she would meet at the session with the documents, which was the answer he had not hoped for, but had prepared himself for. The Regional Water Planning Board session in 2003 was the most attended public meeting in Harrow County's recent history, drawing both the Regional Water Authority representatives who had initiated the acquisition discussion and the local and state press who had been tipped about the story's shape before the session and who had arrived with the understanding that what they were about to watch was the kind of meeting that rewrote a county's understanding of its own territory. Solano presented the hydrological data first, walking the board through the test bore methodology, the reserve capacity certification, and the confined aquifer's pressure characteristics in the accessible language she had developed across 15 years of explaining subsurface hydrology to non-specialist audiences. The Consolidated Western Water Authority's representative presented next, confirming the authority's interest in a water rights conveyance and the valuation the authority had placed on the reserve at current water rights market rates, which was the number that the press had been waiting for, and that produced the room's first extended silence when it was stated. Stuart Hinch was at the head table in his capacity as board member, and he said less throughout the session than any of his colleagues, which the press noted, and which he was aware of them noting, and which he had decided, in the days before the session, was the posture most consistent with the situation he was in, because the alternative was to say something about the listing summary he had filed in 1995 and the information that had and had not been in it, and he had not prepared anything to say about that which he was confident would improve the record. Cora Lund was present and spoke briefly, confirming the terms under which she was willing to discuss a rights conveyance and the specific conditions she had attached to any transaction. Conditions that protected Doris Spears's adjacent property from any extraction infrastructure impact, and that included a community water access provision for plateau area residents at a fixed rate that she had worked into the rights structure before the filing, a detail that the press found as interesting as the valuation number, and that Cora had built into the transaction because she had understood from the day she read the 1962 survey that water in dry country was not simply a commercial asset, and that any structure she built around it needed to reflect that understanding in the documents as clearly as it did in her own private view of what the resource was for. The transaction that ultimately resulted from the board session was not the outright sale the authority had initially proposed. It was a structured water rights conveyance that Cora's attorney had designed to give the authority the access volume it needed for municipal supply planning, while preserving Cora's underlying ownership of the land and the residual rights in the reserve, a structure that the authority's board had initially resisted and that Cora's hydrologist had declined to proceed without, because the reserve capacity was large enough that the initial conveyance was a fraction of what might eventually be needed, and the residual rights in a formation of this documentation were worth more to Cora in long-term terms than any single transaction at current valuation would capture. Stuart Hinch voted in favor of the conveyance arrangement because it was the right arrangement for the public interest the board existed to protect, and because voting against it would have required explaining his alternative on the record, and because he understood, by the time the vote came, that the most useful thing he could do with the position he was in was to make sure the transaction was structured correctly and to make the changes to the county's land asset review process that would mean that what had happened with the 80-acre plateau listing in 1995 did not happen with any comparable listing in the future. He made those changes before the end of his term. They were the last significant administrative action of his tenure and the one that he described, when asked about his work in a county newsletter profile the year after he left, as the one he was most certain needed to be made and most honest about having needed the session to prompt him to make. The lesson Harrow County arrived at from the decade between the $10,000 sale and the water board session was not simple enough to be comfortable, because it was not about malice and not entirely about negligence, and not even entirely about the failure to look at a 33-year-old geological survey, although all of those things were part of it. It was about the specific gap that opens between a community's knowledge of its own land and the land itself, when the knowledge is built from the land's surface and the land keeps its most significant information several hundred feet below that surface. in a formation that surface observation cannot detect, and that only becomes part of the community's accounting when someone with a reason to look for it and a method for finding it decides to check whether what is documented to be there is actually there. Cora Lund had bought 80 acres of land that a county land office had listed as suitable for nothing because she had read a document that said something different from what the listing assumed, and she had spent a decade and most of her savings proving that the document was right. And the $5 million valuation that resulted from that proof was not something she had discovered by luck or by accident or by any quality that couldn't be replicated by anyone who made the same habit she had made, which was to read everything available about a piece of land before deciding what it was worth. Drive past the Lund property on the Plateau Road today, and it looks exactly as it looked in 1995, 80 acres of scrubland with no visible surface water and no visible indication that anything under the brush is worth more than the brush, which is a description that was accurate then and is accurate now and has always been the wrong thing to say about it. The bore site is behind a low fence on the eastern edge of the property, marked with a standard wellhead installation and a State Water Resources Agency tag, and the road to it from the highway passes the corner of Dora Spears's ranch, where Dora has been running cattle on plateau ground for 23 years and who has, since the board session, had access to the community provision water rate that Cora built into the conveyance structure before she filed anything, a detail that the county newspaper mentioned in its coverage of the session and that Dora has mentioned in conversations about the whole affair as the detail she found most characteristic of her neighbor, which is an opinion she has held since the first week she drove over to introduce herself and was shown a 33-year-old survey by a woman who had driven to the state capitol to find it. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find it. Share it with someone who has ever bought something everyone else had already decided was worth nothing and looked underneath the surface before accepting that conclusion. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one every week. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you read something everyone else had skipped and found out why they had been wrong. We read every single one.